the AMA with the framework team, specifically Katie, Ed, and Peter. Welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Hi.
Thank you.
Hello, Europe. I wish I was in Ghent.
Me too.
Yeah.
Before we get into the AMA, we're going to start with a little overview of what's currently happening in Ember.
Yes.
So I'm going to start and then I'll hand it off to Ed and then Peter. So first thing I definitely have to mention is EmberConf 2023. So normally around about now we'd be going to EmberConf, but instead this year it's in July 20th and 21st in Portland, Oregon, as usual. And the CFP ends on March 26th, so that's just a few days. So get your proposals in. And the next big thing happening in Ember is Ember 5.0 should happen in about mid-May. We added a RFC passed an RFC for a new major release cadence. So their new major should happen about every 18 months or so, coincidentally with 12 minors for each major. So roughly every 6 weeks. So that ends up being about 18 months. 5.0 has many fewer and more easily handled deprecations than 4.0. You can see them all on the deprecation guide on the website. You can expect 6.0 around November 2024. And if you want to read more, you should look at the major version process RFC. Remember editions? So the current edition is Octane, and we called everything the 4 times classic. And we introduced editions around the time we introduced Octane. So this is a slide from the 2019 EmberConf keynote. I don't know if anybody remembers it. I've modified it slightly. I think right now we're in this pit of incoherence and headed up, or maybe somewhere headed up this hill to where we want to be. And so editions recognize that as we progress in changing the framework, we reach an incoherent state where there's unequal adoption of new features. So some people are off trying new things. So trying Embroider, trying single file components, and some people are just adhering to how the old edition was. So following Octane per the book, per the guides. So we work towards an edition to have kind of a goal and to create a point of reference for the entire community where the entire set of features are not only coherent, but work well together, work well, and are well documented. And so that that hill we're headed up towards is we've named it Polaris. That's the edition we're working towards. And this is a slide from last year's EmberConf 2022 keynote answering what is Polaris. So we've been talking about Polaris for about a year. I've heard some people saying, what is Polaris? I've never heard of that. If you haven't heard of it, I recommend go watch the 2022 EmberConf keynote or listen to Ed, who's going to take over and discuss some of the Polaris features.
Okay. Yes. So I'm going to go through a quick summary of Polaris and where it is and what it is. And these slides are, I'm adapting some slides that were put together a little earlier by folks like Melanie and Yehuda. So we're going to go through them quickly. That's the one we already saw. So the key messaging around Polaris here really is that we're streamlining Ember with 2 big thrusts of effort, replacing Ember-specific things with modern ecosystem standards and bringing Ember's conventions to modern tooling. So the key target features when you think about Polaris are, I think several of these things are things you've probably heard about if you're somebody who comes to Ember Europe and listens, but the combination of these things together really is what we're trying to make the polished Polaris experience. So I'm going to talk about these things. The template tag here feature is sometimes has been called template imports for historical reasons, but I think when we're talking about it as a community and documenting it and explaining it, calling it template tag is probably the best naming because that's the feature people see. So Embroider. So I'll note that I didn't write these slides, and when they keep saying Embroider is the important thing, it's not because I said so. Actually, Yehuda and Melanie put it in there. But so yes, Embroider is one of the central pillars here of Polaris, and it touches many of the other features and unlocks them and makes them better. So a lot of the goal here is there's several different goals. One of the ones I'm most excited about is we're getting quite close to the place where we can demonstrate real world Ember apps with much faster developer build experiences. Where even if you're on Embroider now, you're not getting that quite yet. I mean, you're getting on many apps, you're already getting comparable speed to the classic build. but we're looking to go much, much faster. And that's starting to align as we're able to clean up more things in the ecosystem and turn off more of our compatibility layers and move some of that code around. So the speedy dev experience is really one that I'm excited about. The speedy critical path, that would be more for your end users. That's also really important. That's really the biggest reason I think the early adopter companies who've gone in with Embroider already they're there because they're getting that. They see the benefit to smaller app loads for their users by splitting things up and getting that automatic splitting. Compatible is, of course, the name of the game, right? If we weren't going to be backward compatible, we could just do anything, completely just adopt an existing build system, but that wouldn't really help get our ecosystem over the hump. So compatible is the name of the game. That doesn't mean, of course, that no code has to change, but it means that we need to create smooth paths for code to change over time. And so that you're not blocked on a huge amount of stuff that's out of your control. And future looking really just means that, we are oriented around web standards and not locked into implementations in ways that we used to be in the past, so that, switching to Embroider isn't locking us into yet another like very Ember specific thing. It's really escaping us from that box and then letting us pick the best of the tooling that comes down the pipe for all JavaScript. In terms of the tech that's in Embroider, right? Like the big stuff is really making everything really be ES modules everywhere. That's like always been true in Ember for the authoring format for a very, very long time. And that's really why Embroider is even possible. But there's a lot of places in the classical build where people can do non-ES module things. So like the big takeaway I'd give you here is if you've got add-ons you maintain or apps you maintain that call things like require and define manually, that's where you're not really following the ES modules. And that's where you will have to refactor that stuff eventually. We can get compatibility with an awful lot of that still, but to truly be on a purely modules build, a good example of what you'll get is like actually just executing real ES modules in the browser can be a really nice development experience. And that's only going to work if you really follow the module spec, because browsers aren't going to let you cheat on the module spec. Modern packages, this is really a lot of stuff in the NPM ecosystem has finally matured to a point where it's usable. Node's ES module support hasn't been the easiest to adopt, but it's got a solid implementation. The wider ecosystem is getting adoption in features like the exports key in package JSON and type module in package JSON really do let you opt into doing things a modern way in node packages and in ways that are broadly compatible with most tooling that looks at JavaScript, whether that's a Vite or a Webpack or a Rollup or a Snowpack or something like that. And also TypeScript. So like modern TypeScript is getting there as well with support for these features. So making sure that we're aligned with all that is quite important. It really helps smooth a lot of things that used to be much worse. So the standard publishing format, this is one of the things we did very earliest with Embroider, because it's the thing that is the most ecosystem wide, making sure that add-ons can be published in a way that's going to be forward compatible. And we've had a lot of great contributions from folks helping polish up the V2 add-on blueprint, which now does exist, and add-ons are shipping in V2, and V2 add-ons work under classic builds. We've got a list of known issues we continue to work through for cases where they don't work, and we're like steadily hammering away on those and helping companies who have like internal add-ons. Some people have been excited about trying to convert those and be early adopters, all of which is going to help them with Embroider adoption and developer experience and help us get the last bugs out of the format. So standard authoring format is really about making sure we have really clear tooling for how it is you go from Ember code to just normal JavaScript code. And so an example of this is that a package like Babel plugin Ember template compilation is now actually a much more clean and complete tool for converting all Ember template stuff into what it needs to do in a bunch of different environments. And that's something that you already take advantage of in classic builds and also in Embroider. And it's the kind of thing that's going to let it make us much easier to swap out different and future-looking build systems and tooling if we have very, relatively clear interfaces and tools for like what are the specific things that are special about our conventions, and how do you go from that to a much more standard, normal, vanilla publication format, something that is probably more verbose than what you write in your code that you're authoring, but is legible to all JavaScript understanding tools. And then the migration strategy, most of what we're talking about is migration strategy. So status-wise, there's a lot of stuff already done, and there's a lot of people already taking advantage of it. One fact is that there's a lot of Embroider-related tech already sneaking into the builds that you already have in classic builds. So a big one is that all Ember apps in the 4.0 era have to use Ember Auto Import, and Ember Auto Import is a polyfill for a large subset of what Embroider has. And it's going to be a polyfill for even more. We've got some ongoing work to let it opt into doing more things for you in your application that make your application more Embroider-like and can ease the adoption path. Another example is Embroider Macros is a utility that works in both Classic and Embroider, and it gives you a declarative way to do things that you might have had to do with Broccoli specific or like build system specific code that you can now do declaratively and easing adoption. Add-ons are definitely migrating. A bunch have published, and some really good contributions across the community as people have been helping do that, both in terms of like the benefit of getting them into V2 and the benefit of having people contributing back to the tooling and the bug fixing and all that's involved in that. Ember itself is working toward becoming a much more normal dependency. So the Ember source package itself. So we have an open PR that's really trying to get Ember source really caught up to just being a normal and clean classic V1 add-on. And then that's going to ease its jump to V2. And we have multiple people contributing on that effort across the community. And the tooling is getting there. So this is a note about really, it's broader than just Embroider. It's tooling around all the Ember stuff and all the things that we want to have in Polaris. Lots of work is happening that isn't necessarily visible if you're just looking at things like Ember release notes, because there's a lot of packages out there that support the whole thing. And examples of that are like prettier support landing for template tag and ESLint support for it, and the improvements to Glint and the Ember language server and all that sort of stuff. So the things that are still actively being designed that are a part of the Polaris story are routing services and engines. And this is really where the last spots in Ember where we have non-ES module based resolution rules going on. And so these are, let's see, I guess there's not more detail on the routing. So on routing, there's a routing strike team that's meeting weekly and spiking out designs. A great reference on that is, the talk I gave at Emberfest this past fall was really my vision for what I think we needed to do for routing. And a bunch of folks have taken that work forward and have begun doing spikes on how to really take all of the pieces of our reactivity model, our lifetime model, and sketch out what routing could look like for Polaris. So that's still design phase, but people are actively building spikes, and there's an active strike team that's meeting weekly, and you should totally feel free to get involved with that. Find them in the Discord. Services is on this list because service injection is another area where today we kind of have Ember magic linking together files. It would be nicer if we could like find a way to translate that to ES modules, right? Just because both for Typescript to understand it more easily, and for JavaScript, general purpose JavaScript build tooling to understand it more clearly, so that we know when a service is only needed sometimes, right? And it not just make all services global all the time. And engines is on this list also because engines as an implementation has a bunch of stuff that's tied to the old build and a bunch of assumptions. And a lot of what you need from engines is things that are fundamentally already available under Embroider, like the ability to split code and the ability to isolate certain pieces of your application and not accidentally leak components and helpers and things across far apart places of your application. A lot of those features are already baked into Polaris, both between Embroider for the build splitting, template tag for the strictness of like importing the things you need. So engines really, we definitely need them to keep working. We're not saying stop using engines, but we do want to make sure we design a really clear primitive for engines under this new world. And I think it's going to make them a much smaller feature set because they'll be able to lean on so much that's already in here. Most of what this really comes down to is clearly documenting and cleaning up what it means to boot and mount an Ember app. And an engine is itself an app, right? And engines is really rules for just booting and mounting them together. So there are folks actively working on that as well. So those are the things that are currently in design rather than implementation. So the key point here is Embroider drives almost everything else in Polaris. because it's the authoring and publishing formats and it's about mapping on ecosystem standards. This really addresses a couple of things. And one is that we want to be able to take advantage of stuff out in the ecosystem. Another is that there's just no reason for us to have to spend our efforts maintaining Ember specific versions of things when there's perfectly good ones that are not, when there's things that are not unique to what we're doing. We should focus our efforts on the parts of Ember that are unique to Ember's conventions and values and technology, and general purpose stuff like build this application code that's just a bunch of ES modules that follow a standard. We don't need to keep doing it our own way anymore. So the next big feature, and probably the biggest user-facing feature in Polaris, is template tag, right? And this is the idea of being able to have your templates alongside your components right in one syntax. This is a feature that's totally available and usable already. You add the Ember template imports add-on. The main work around this that really remains is documenting and cleaning up the kind of tooling experience around it, making it, for example, documenting how it is you set up so that your syntax highlighter is going to work correctly with this syntax, your ESLint is going to work with it, etc. And if you're using TypeScript, your glint integration so that it's all type checked. But all that is definitely stuff that works now and people are using it. I've worked on some apps already that have it, and once you have it, it's really fantastic and you don't want to not have it anymore. It is quite a nice experience. People have talked for a long time about the value of having a single file for your template and your component. But a bigger piece of this is that, and that's nice too, but the thing that is biggest for me is that it is strict with actually being able to import and invoke things. This is the thing that means you don't need special magic anymore to organize your application. Whereas something like engines really was needed when you had no other tools for structuring your code. Now you can use all the things you know how to do with JavaScript to structure where you put your code, right? We still want to have good conventions so that people know where to put things, but those don't have to be, you don't have to be locked into one of them anymore. You can, if you have one team working on one whole feature area, they can have their own subdirectory or npm package or anything they want. So that is pretty big for the understandability of the framework. It's understandable to build tools and understandable to users in a way that it wasn't before, and very understandable with TypeScript, which is really huge. To have TypeScript types all the way through your templates is very, very nice. And to be able to, use an auto refactor tool in your editor to rename some argument to a component and have it update everywhere in the app that calls that component, right? That kind of stuff really does just work now when you use glint and Ember template imports. So that leads me to TypeScript support. TypeScript support is another big piece of what is first class in Polaris for the first time in an Ember edition. There's been a lot of great work that you might have seen in the RFC process around how it works. Right now, in current Ember releases, you can opt into the preview types, and that's first-class types coming in Ember source instead of needing all of the definitely typed third-party packages. That gives you a lot more stability. Right now, it's preview types, and that's because we're in a period where we have to get the add-on ecosystem over the hump so that they will all work with those types. But I've had a pretty good experience already using it, and it was not very difficult. I think one app that I converted to use the first class types, not a tiny app, an app with some meat to it. There was only I think I had one add-on I had to patch, something in Ember concurrency that's probably already now fixed upstream. So that was a really nice experience. And of course, this isn't mandatory. Non-TypeScript apps are always totally supported in Ember, but everybody benefits from having the types there because then your own editors and language servers know more about the code and can give you better auto completion and pop-ups and all that sort of thing. So reactivity in Polaris is really, there's nothing super, the fundamentals here are not super new. They're things that you're very familiar with already in Octane, like tracked. But with Polaris, we really want to clarify and crystallize and document the best patterns and really take advantage of the tracked systems reactivity throughout the framework. In a way that we haven't historically. So for example, making tracked built-ins actually built in is one of the things that I think that RFC has already landed. I don't remember the exact status of it, but provided in the default blueprint versions of map and array and things that are just auto-tracked automatically to interact with the tracking system Resources as a concept is a thing that we've discussed it a bunch. You can check out, these talks from Emberfest that both spend a lot of time talking about resources. We really would like to ship one API for resources that is like officially part of the blueprint, because we think it is a key concept for reactivity in Polaris. And we think it's the underlying primitive that's under so many other things, including services. Services under this model really their implementation becomes something much closer to a resource. Their interface can look pretty close to what they have now, although I think we want, as I said earlier, something modules-based and less stringly based to index them. But their implementation is really resource-like, scoped to the lifetime of the application. And routing, routes have a relatively complicated life cycle of when hooks happen and when things start and end. And all of that really can be modeled under resources too. So when we think about the reactivity system in Polaris, it's really taking the track system we already have in Octane and making it truly be the way we do all the reactive stuff throughout the framework, including some things that we still have today in Octane that predate tracked, right? Like there's a lot of stuff in the router, for example, or in Ember data that predate the existence of tracked. And now we would really like to make them fully integrated. So on the status of that stuff, Yehuda has been working on Starbeam as the kind of core for how you make different systems talk to each other with reactivity. And like there's a bunch of docs and examples and things you can look at. We would like to see that, like the Ember integrations with that as a possible way to do things like resources in Ember. There's the Ember Resources add-on, which is actively working to try to converge with all of the learnings from Starbeam. And track built-ins, the add-on is, I believe, now already just added to the blueprint. So the router I mentioned as one of the areas under active design. So the status of it really is that we have a pretty good idea of the design requirements. There's an active group of people meeting weekly. You should go find them on Discord and join in. Right now, they've been doing an analysis of all the other kind of framework routers that are out there right now, and experimenting with the tracked URL API, as well as a bunch of questions around resources and how, what the resources are really going to look like and how they interact with the router. So, so the requirements here, as I said, reactivity without classic dependencies that aligns the critical path goals with modern bundle names. So what we mean here by critical path goals is making sure that if our router is designed well, you'll get really nice code splitting very automatically. And so, for example, we want to make sure that if you have a loading state with a loading spinner, you want to make sure that loading spinner itself is available immediately, and while the code that it's actually waiting to load is loading. It would be a mistake, of course, if to load the loading spinner, you had to also load the code that you were waiting for with the loading spinner, right? So like the loading of the code and the data at multiple split points, we really want to make sure we design the API nicely so that that falls out quite automatically, and that the default experience gives people good code splitting. And gives people power to do more complicated things when they want to opt into really hand optimizing something. So the related goals for Polaris is one of them is to make the Ember classic object model optional, meaning things like Ember object, Ember component. If you refactor the last one of those out of your application, it would be nice if none of that code is weighing down your application. Ember source is an add-on. I mean, it is already an add-on in the official sense. It's been a weird add-on historically, and we're trying to make it a lot less weird and make it a much more normal library that's easier to consume. We'd love to pretty soon show an example repo that only uses the new stuff. Consolidate Ember language service support. This is really just trying to polish that experience of the tooling, as I mentioned. Today, you do have to kind of read around some readmes and figure out what to install in your editor to get good experience with the template tag. There is good experience once you figure that stuff out, but we'd really like to consolidate that into one thing and one set of instructions or one package to install. And one of my near-term goals is to get the Vite adapter for Embroider working. It's what we're actively working toward right now with a lot of really foundational work. But I expect that when we want to go to Embroider as a default experience, it will probably be Vite as the packager by default, as our default choice. And with the goal of having a really fast and nice developer experience. For those who haven't tried it, one of the things that's nice about Vite is that it really leverages the browser's native module loader, and it does very little work, relatively speaking, in the build side. It's still doing file by file transpilation for features that need transpilation, but then the module graph itself, all that stuff can be done directly in the browser. So that means when you change one file, only one file gets touched by the build tools and goes out to the browser directly. And all the rest is able to use things like HTTP caching to just be there still. So you could get, so particularly rebuilds on big applications, we should expect to see much better performance. And some other things here, answering questions about how someone can play with future Ember. Interesting RFCs would be things like, there's been a bunch of talk about PNPM as a package manager. It's a pretty good one and doesn't have some of the same limitations and loosenesses that Yarn and NPM have. So, there's an RFC right now to at least add support for PNPM officially, and there'd be questions of whether we should recommend PN. That's kind of an open question. Questions about what to teach people about pods as a kind of legacy feature that is still lurking throughout a lot of our code that we don't want to break, but that we want to help people understand how to move toward the modern patterns, right? So open stuff we're working on. So this was the key messaging. This is a slide we already went through. I'm not going to reiterate it because I want to make sure I go quick, but we really just want to make sure, everybody in the community gets the point of what we're achieving here, which is really is a big streamlining where we're able to take advantage of all the things out in the ecosystem that are good to have that we didn't have the first time through when we were building these features, and now we do. I think this gets me to the end of my section. Yes, I will hand off to Peter.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about RFC stages. The RFC process, as probably many of you are familiar with, is the way we design, implement, and shepherd changes and features added to Ember. And it affects the entire community. The prior RFC process, kind of as a refresher here, is that we previously only covered the proposed and accepted states, but after that, it was basically done. We said, hey, we merged it, we accepted it, and that was kind of the end of the story, at least as far as official tracking went. And unfortunately, what that means is that if you go back and look at our RFC list, there's some out there that were never implemented or ignored or effectively discontinued. And sometimes, people would have a RFC, they want to help with something, figure out what they could do to be involved, and it just wasn't always clear to them where things stood, what the next steps were. And ultimately, after experimenting some, we landed upon a new approach for RFC stages. Katie did a lot of this work. There are others involved as well. But that moves us to, we have these 5/6 kind of a little more stages here. And this is basically trying to encapsulate what we were already effectively doing, but put it in a clearer state so people could really go and look and see and understand and make sure that we ourselves didn't miss things as we were going through the whole process. The first stage is proposed. Any RFC that is created, open on the repo, it starts in proposed stage. It's basically a suggestion. It might not be complete at this point. And it's just an open pull request that using an RFC template. And then what ends up happening is basically the core teams or the other the relevant Ember teams related to that work end up looking through these and discussing them and saying, hey, yeah, this is something that we think is a good idea. Maybe it's still not quite done yet. Maybe it needs a little more work, a little more polish. But this is a thing that we are actively interested in and want to see happen and be supported. And there may be not we're not maybe actively working on, but it is the direction we want to see things moving. We think it's a good idea. Then once we get to the point of accepted, these are now ones that are actually merged into the repo. And basically these are fully fleshed out, well-considered plans. And usually that's going to be, ideally that's accompanied by having a core team member that is the champion that is essentially going to help make sure that it actually sees and gets all the way through to completion. When this happens, we have some cool automation that Katie set up where we actually, I can open a PR that will advance to the next stage, which is ready to release. And then we can use that PR as a guide for what is involved in getting to that next stage. Once we're ready to complete, to merge that PR, we basically are saying, hey, the feature is done. As far as we can tell, it's behind a flag if that's relevant. The API documentation is complete. And we are committed to moving forward with it at this point. Once that everyone agrees, then it actually goes into a release. And again, we'll open another pull request. Once we merge the ready for release PR, we'll open another pull request to move to released. At that point, we're saying, hey, the work is published, it's released. But our work isn't necessarily done because, well, maybe it's released, maybe we think it's quality and it works. We still haven't fully committed to it. We said it's good enough to go in a release, but not something that necessarily we're advocating for. There are definitely, nothing to make examples offhand, maybe someone can pop in with the chat. But there are definitely things where we said, hey, this is the feature, we've merged it, but we've never really told people how to use it, how to document it, how to really make it first class and fully support it. And so again, when we merge that release PR, we open up a new PR and move to recommended. And at recommended, we're basically saying, hey, we have guides. It's integrated into the documentation. We have code mods to help migrate to this if it's relevant. Add-ons are upgraded. We have debugging tools. Essentially, we have the full sort of set of things. And it's interesting, as we've worked through this process, I've definitely noticed that I found features like, oh yeah, we released that feature, but it's not documented anywhere. It's not in the guides. I mean, maybe if you go look in the API docs, you'll find it mentioned, but how do you really know how to use it? Or we're not even telling people we can use it. So this is a really important part of our stages. It's not just enough that we've merged the code and that it's out there. It's actually, we need to have really incorporated it into the way of thinking and into the way we present it to everyone. And this is really the stage that we're working to get all the Polaris features too. You know, we'll sort of consider the Polaris edition. I think it's safe to say we basically consider Polaris as being released when all of the component parts have gotten to this recommended stage. Oops. And then practically, if you're interested in following along and seeing where things are, if you go to the RFCs repo, that's github.com/Ember.js/RFCs. I can throw a link there. Easy enough, I'll throw a link in the chat. If you go there, you can go actually go in and see in the description of quick links to the different stages. And you can follow along, see where something stands. I just added a new tag. It's not necessarily complete, but it is a tag for Polaris RFCs. And so the idea is here basically you can go if you want to see sort of, hey, where do things for Polaris stand? You can go in and check out this tag, see where things are, see the checklist for things to move on. There's still a bit more fleshing out. Not everything is quite represented there in an RFC, but we do want to expand upon that. And I continue, you can see, you know, I'll share my screen here in 1 second. I can share my screen here and we can go, well, not share my screen, but share another part of my screen. All right. If you look along here, we can actually see there's Polaris. We can see some of these. I'll make it a little bigger for you on. We have like some TypeScript ones. We have enable Embroider is one that is we work out with, but that's what we're kind of tracking there. I think a good one here is this first class components templates. You can kind of see some of the different items here. It also has its own Quest issue that we link to. But if you kind of want to go in there and see where things stand, see what may need to be done, if you've played around with something and you're like, hey, I think we're kind of missing this thing, you know, it's a good place for going in there and seeing. And we're new to this whole process. We're working to expand on it further and to better implement it all. There are definitely going to be some rough edges and gaps you may see. And if you see those, please call them out. We appreciate everyone's help and assistance in this regard. Yeah, that's kind of wraps up our little presentation here. I don't have a closing slide beyond this, but I just wanted to thank you all, and we can get into answering questions.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for the update. That was pretty comprehensive already. And also welcome our surprise guest, Yehuda, if you're still there. Good to have you. I think the update answered some questions already, probably, but I'm sure there's more. One is, And I think that hasn't been answered completely. At what stage of progress is Polaris? And if the community could help, where should the focus, where should they focus their attention?
Sure, I could start with that one. So I would say that there's a couple key areas where help is really needed. One is certainly add-on authors many have already been helpful in testing their apps, testing their add-ons under Embroider and doing add-on conversions to the new format. That's all very useful, and anybody can help, pick up, look at the add-ons you're using, figure out how to help them get tested and updated so that they're, as a minimum, like compatible with Embroider, and at a maximum updated to the V2 package format. So that's it across the ecosystem lift. Other things in the core of the project, we have a very active group of folks contributing to Embroider itself, showing up to our weekly office hours, which you can find in the Dev Embroider channel on Discord. I would invite more folks to come and hear how things are going and hear what we're working on and look for opportunities to contribute. We definitely try to highlight those when we find them. So in order to push core features forward. And again, a lot of times the work is in packages that are not the obvious ones. So, a fix here and a fix there can go a long way to making people's experience good. And then for the key things that are not fully designed yet, or particularly routing, I would encourage folks to get involved with the kind of routing strike team that's gathered. There's a weekly meeting for that too. Pop in there to see how that work is going and participate in helping spike out the features, because I would say that's the area that's probably the area with the most technical risk remaining, because that one's in design still and we don't have the final APIs yet that we want. Whereas stuff like Embroider is much further along. We know I think we have a pretty good sense of what work remains to stabilize Embroider and bring a good experience to people. So that's a more mature project that's further along than, say, a Polaris generation router, which is still going back and forth on what's the API we really want. So I would say definitely, any of those are great ways for people to get involved. So that's the kind of status of the project. Different things are maturing at different rates because some has been going longer than others. So routing really did kind of have to come toward the end because it caps over so many of the other features, right? It's built on assumptions about Embroider, assumptions about reactivity, assumptions about resources. So it really does bring all those other things together, which would kind of make sense that it's the last piece designed, but it is the one that needs the most design.
I want to answer the question from a slightly different tack, which is, I think that's all correct in terms of what work needs to be done. And I think that's probably the question, the person that you wanted to ask. I think one thing that is good one thing that's good to think about is that there's a big gap between when Embroider would, in theory, actually be complete in terms of code and when it would really be usable by most people. And I think you can easily see that with template tag now, where for the most part, the template tag feature is feature complete in Ember. If you install the add-on and use it, it does everything it's supposed to do. However, there's a huge gap where anybody, including me, who tries to get it working in an Ember app is going to have to figure out what add-ons to install, what VS Code add-ons to install. And there's a bunch of them. You have to make some choices. If you're using Typescript, you need to install a plugin and then add it to your TS config, right? So there's all these steps to get it working. And so I think it's easy to look at that situation and just be oh, it seems like it is just as much done as the router. From your perspective, it is about as usable as the router because it would take a lot of effort to get it working. But from the perspective of what it takes to get it over the finish line and what you could contribute to, actually a huge thing that people can contribute to on template tag is documenting what the current steps would have to be to get it working, and then B, start doing work on consolidating the language server, right? There's no reason why we have 4 different VS Code add-ons, right? And that's a pretty different thing in character than designing the router. So I think we need to communicate a little better exactly what the status is on these things. But a lot of features, I think there's a spectrum, right? Template tag is more or less completely done. Embroider is quite along in the sense that a lot of the features that we want to have happen already exist. There's some amount of additional design, some additional changes, some of like getting things working with Vite and stuff like that. But like, I would put it at like 90-95% if you added up all the implementation time from the beginning of the project until when it will eventually be done, right? And then you have stuff like Starbeam and the like, which is like maybe like 50% or something implementation, and the router, which is like probably like 0% implementation at this point, right? So those all feel the same to you because even the template tag thing is so hard to use. But in terms of what you can do to help get something over the finish line, like the template tag thing is very low hanging fruit.
Yeah, if you go look at the at that RFC I just linked, you can see that the template tag stuff, that it's polished stuff largely that's in that list there. Like it works. I mean, I'm using it. We're using it. The apps are using it. But
Even the
there
tooling.
are rough edges. There are rough edges. I mean, especially if you think about, it's very close to being in a released state for our RFCs. There's definitely more work to do to have it recommended still, just because of tooling and polish and things like that, to really make it a nice, fully like Ember quality experience, right?
Yeah, that's probably kind of the 80-20%, right? The last 20% take 80% of the time, sort of, until it's actually out. And otherwise, we can use another one of those that we collected before, and I think that also relates to what you just talked about. And the question is, how do you all see the general health of Ember and its wider community? And I think that also kind of relates to that pit of incoherence that you mentioned before, right? It's kind of not the ideal place, and you don't want to be there too long, probably. When you're there, sort of people start to worry about the state of things, maybe. I know it's a big question, but
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way of putting it. I think that's at least part of the problem, right? I mean, I think I kind of alluded to a little bit with the RFC stages as well, is that we're trying to do the work to help people really feel invested and see where things are, so it's not this black box. Because I think sometimes people have gotten this kind of incorrect perception that, oh, there's just these few people who make all the decisions and it kind of happens behind closed doors, and I want to get involved, but I don't really know what to do. And we're really trying to move things out into the open so people can see. And really, because this is open source, none of us are, we don't have a dictator, we don't have a single company running it. I think all of us here work for different companies, all four of us who are in this, in the core team here. And, we are committed to the long-term health of Ember, and it's really important to us and to our companies and those we work with. And I think we're working on sort of telling and refining that story to get back out of that pit of incoherence, which I think is a great way to think about it, and explain why we have some of the angst I think people have. And again, working to really get that development story into the open so people can see what's happening, see where things stand. Something I want to do soon is start doing a sort of update blog post on where the different RFCs sit, and just call out things that people can do to help and make that a little more public and really loop people in.
Yeah. And I just want to say, no, I think there is definitely, I think people definitely detect some real things that happen in any project that goes on long enough, which is like people come and go, and you have ups and downs with individual participations. So, we've definitely had to fill in after certain people who were very active in the community had to step back. They had changes in their lives and pandemics and kids and jobs and health and all kinds of problems, right? And so what we recognize that, and to keep any long-lived project going, you always have to be cultivating a new crop of contributors. And I've been seeing really, really fruitful progress on that. A lot of the folks that you'll see coming to these strike teams I've been alluding to, really doing core work on getting Polaris shipped, are not folks who might have been on a core team for years. We've been trying to bring in new folks, and we have a bunch of new folks doing a ton of work. I can't name everybody to do justice to all the contributors, but I don't know if anybody's noticed how much of Bert DeBlock contributing to Ember CLI, for example, Ember CLI core team member now, and huge contributor who has stepped up and filled gaps that would have been done by other folks 2 years ago, right? And has really landed a whole bunch of the stuff that lets us do 5.0 correctly in Ember CLI. So we have a lot of folks chipping in, and of course we want even more of that, and that's definitely an area of attention. As core teams, we think about it a lot. We think about ways to try to make it more inviting for more folks at more Ember using companies to both to like feel empowered to be part of the project, and to give them tools to help explain to the management at their companies how it really is in their interests to spend some of their efforts contributing back, because you get so much more in return, by being part of a healthy ecosystem. So we definitely like acknowledge the challenges of being a long-lived project where the same people are not going to always be around, and that's okay. We want it to be a project that can live beyond any single contributor.
Yeah, that was awesome. That I want to follow up on something Peter said a little bit, which is, or back to the original pit of incoherence point. Similar to what Ed just said, it's sort of inherent in the development process that would happen. That's sort of how we arrived at it, which like basically the process is you add some features, you keep adding some features. You don't remove the old features until the new features are really ready. So while you're adding the features, there's just now 2 features that do the same thing. And unless you have the magic wand that is like basically a ring of power where you think, oh, I can just swap it at an instant, right? Unless you think you can swap the old feature to the new feature like instantaneously, you're just going to have some period of time in every development cycle where the old features are still there, the new features aren't quite ready yet, and you're incrementally landing the new features. And that to me is like where the pit of incoherence comes from. I think so. Fundamentally, there's some amount of that that's going to happen. I think a couple things about that. First of all, when you start noticing it's happening, that's a very strong sign in the Ember process that we're ready for an addition. And so like, I think first of all, just emotionally, it's good to channel that in the positive direction towards, oh, that means like that feeling that I'm feeling things aren't quite right, or it feels confusing, coherent. That means it's time to make an addition. That's first of all. Second of all, as Ed said, there's better and worse ways to communicate what's happening. And I think Ed and Peter both said, and there's definitely a sense in which some aspects of the progress and the reason why things are in the incoherent state that they're in is not as easy to see as it might be good to be able to, right? So like template tag, for example, I think I keep coming back to that because if you like a very concrete example of the pit of incoherence is if you're paying attention to Ember's future, you're going to be aware that template tag is really where things are going, and that probably in a few years, like most people's code, new code for sure, and like most people have migrated to template tag, right? And so a lot of the conceptual work that people talk about has to do with the template tag feature. At the same time, like everybody's day-to-day life more or less involves using the existing system, and certain amount of like, oh, what should we do about this problem? It's channeled into, oh, we're going to solve that problem in the future, right? So that like that feeling that I just described, which everybody doesn't like, including like even people on the core team don't like. That is what the pit of incoherence in general feels like, and I think it's intrinsic. But but that said, communicating, hey, the situation is we have a template tag feature, it needs these things to finish. In the meantime, we still have this other feature, and here's the transition path looks like. Communicating that as clearly as possible with as much checkpoint information along the way helps make it obvious why that is happening, right? So I think so for me, it's important to separate like that it is happening, which I think is a positive. It means we're making feature, we're doing things, right? But how easy is it to understand why it's happening and to orient yourself and your code bases towards what's going on, like that is a different challenge, and it's one that we definitely need to work on more.
One more question here that came up in the chat was also Philippe suggesting that there could be like a mechanism for sort of strike teams to be formed around like certain topic, whether the core team is looking for more help, for example, on the website somehow, sort of having more, like, I guess the idea is sort of having more sort of active mechanisms of like pulling more people into the project. Is that something you have considered in any way?
I mean, I think that would be great. we don't have that yet, but it's, if someone wants to help figure out how we can make that happen too, I mean, I think any of us are happy to talk with people, right? And make people feel unblocked. All of us also have other jobs. None of us are full-time Ember people, full-time Ember core people. Many of us work with Ember full-time, but so anything you guys can do to help, is really any interest you have would be great.
We have had some conversations about clarifying, where we already have energy and where we need more. And an example of that is just that, the learning team is historically the ones who took care of the website stuff. And a lot of that work has really fallen into two different buckets there. One is really infrastructural stuff. There's a bunch of people who keep the infrastructure going and have worked on improvements to the infrastructure for hosting docs and the sites and all that stuff. And then the second piece of that is really more like the how do we teach this section of the RFC process, making sure that the whole design is coherent and teachable. And, kind of at the moment, the official purpose of the learning team is to be both of those things. But, maybe we want to make it easier for people to contribute to one or the other, and identify where we need more energy and find folks and make it clearer that both kinds of opportunities to contribute are available. So those are conversations we definitely have, and be interested in hearing folks' opinions and how they're interested in getting involved. I also don't want to speak too strongly for some of the other teams where I haven't had the chance to be deeply involved in what they're currently working on. So I couldn't tell you what happened at the learning team's last meeting this past week. But, so there's a lot of folks to talk to though about how to get involved. If you have specific stuff you're thinking about, particularly if it's like, hey, can we make this thing on the website better? There really shouldn't be a blocker. And if you feel blocked or stonewalled, definitely ping us even individually, ask in the channels, or, if you're not getting success with that, come and, feel free to message me or any of the rest of us so that we can help you figure out the organizational blockage. Because it's definitely true that, any organization has structural challenges over time, as the person who used to do that isn't doing it anymore and nobody started thinking about doing it, and there's a gap, and identifying those things and finding people to step up and fill those gaps is extremely helpful.
I'm on the core learning team. So if you want to know more, please come and find me after this talk. Exactly what Ed is saying. We have a lot of stuff we maintain at the core learning team, and we're always happy to help get people onboarded. So if you want to write for the Ember Times, that's a low-key entrance into contributing. We do that. If you want to look into moving stuff to GitHub Actions, I know Jen and Chris are working to move a lot of our guide stuff there. Find us on the Dev Ember Learning channel on Discord, and we are super happy to have you and have you help us out there. So Ed, thank you for speaking up for us, because we need it.
Thanks. I wanted to mention that, even if you don't feel like you can contribute to some of the stuff that's going on for Polaris, so the routing is still nebulous, that's design phase, that's not something you're interested in, or you don't know anything about tooling. What you can do is find something that is like a maintenance task, or something that somebody who's going to be working on these things has to do regularly, and take over it so that they free up more time. So I started doing the Ember releases years ago because I wanted to free up more of Robert Jackson's time to do the things that only he could do. He didn't need to be spending half an hour a week releasing the Ember.js beta. So you, especially around documentation, you can find some things there to take tasks off of people's lists. Like every deprecation there is has to have a deprecation guide written. You could take that off of their list. You can look for bugs they're easily approachable. And if you're more comfortable with the node side of things, if you're more comfortable writing tooling and utilities, the Embroider side, the Ember CLI side is all on that. It's less library development, more of a kind of the run of the mill systems node stuff. So
I think that's also probably a great way to end the AMA, sort of that invitation of everyone to sort of actively help maintaining and involving Ember. And we're significantly over time anyway, so I think we kind of have to end. So thanks again to Katie, Yehuda, Peter, and Ed for joining us for this AMA and giving us the update. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Marco, and all the organizers there. And just as a last shout out, there were questions in the chat about how, I know many of you are aware that Main Matter has been working on an effort to get more full-time help on Embroider. That's fantastic. That we've been closely working on that with us and the core teams. It seems like that's happening. That's a great example of the community coming together to really help push things over the edge. So all that's to the positive. It's really helping add the energy we need to do that last 20% takes the 80% that Marco was alluding to really give a polished experience.
Thanks everybody supporting us with that and supporting Ember through that. And if you want to get involved, then please talk to me later.
He didn't pay me to say that. I was legitimately.
No. Thanks, Ed. Yeah, thanks again for joining us, and see you all in Portland, maybe EmberConf, or next time Ember Europe or Ember Fest. Thanks.